Generational influence, Deftones. It's undeniable that Deftones has been influencing bands for over, 30 years? From the obliterating guitar to the spacious vocals. There's obviously way more than that to the band, but there's a recipe, and that's what I'm trying to get at. And this recipe, I feel like a bunch of bands that are coming up right now really resonate with. The evolution of Deftones cannot be wiped away from existence. From their scorching hot 1995 Adrenaline album all the way down to their 2020 Ohms soft yet explosive album, they grew into their own, and there's no doubt that they separated themselves from that new metal movement that started around the mid to late 90s. An influence I feel like started even with their first Adrenaline album that released in 95, or you could say their Around the Fur album. But for some reason I feel like this generation that I'm growing up in, and I'm 22 years old for reference, I feel like there's just more adoration and more that people want to take from this band, Deftones, and want to implement it in their own bands, whether it be vocal like inflections or even riffs. Deftones is just on a high pedestal when it comes to the online community, and usually speaking, fans online or / TikTok gravitate towards a song that turns into a sound being a cut clip from a song, and that just becomes catchy, that they put in the background of a video. It blows up, it's there for weeks or even months. I feel like there's a cycle with Deftones that this happens almost every couple months, and I'm not complaining, I'm just stating that there is an admiration for the band. And yeah, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. There's been so many bands pumped out in the last 5 years that sort of have a Deftones type of sound or feel. I wouldn't say that they're ripping off Deftones, because maybe that's disrespectful. We all take an influence, and that's been going on forever in music. I mean, if you like someone, you kind of want to implement that into a sound in your band. Stuff like that, that's been around forever. Now let me move on to some bands that might have a Deftones sound but are their own band in their own way. Starting off with the band Fleshwater. And Fleshwater is a band I've been vocal about on TikTok about how I'm not really the biggest fan of the band, but that doesn't mean I hate them. I actually like some parts about the band. For example, the riffs that they put together are kind of crazy in my opinion. It does have a late 90s, 2000s distortion sound vibe to it, with such a subtle new metal energy. I do hear a lot of Chino Moreno in the vocals, and that is not a bad thing because Chino Moreno has created such an iconic sound with just his voice, but for some reason it doesn't click in my brain. It doesn't really resonate that much, and I don't know why. In my opinion, the lead singer does do a good job floating on each song, but I don't know. Everything about the band, I understand why a bunch of people gravitate towards it, because it's a sound that you've heard before, but it's just someone else. It's a different band. They put their own twist on it, and that's cool. Fleshwater does have I would say, a big fan base online, and I feel like they're going to be even bigger next year probably. It all depends on touring, and they will be going on tour next year in 2024 with a bunch of bands. This next band though, let me move on, I have talked about on my channel before, and that band being Narrowhead. A band I'm clearly a fan of, but that's not how my relationship started with Narrowhead. Before, I wouldn't even say I disliked the band, I just didn't really care or want to pay attention. But this opinion did a complete 180 once they released their latest album, Moments of Clarity. They finally sounded like they were confident and had an identity. Earlier stuff didn't do too much for me because of the Deftones-like inflections to the vocals. Even though they had those moments, I don't think it was intentional to sound so similar. I would even say the band is more influenced by like a Helmet instead. Helmet always has those crazy riffs like on In the Meantime. That being said, I'm not saying they're ripping off Helmet either. Moments of Clarity showed a variety in the tunes, and in my opinion, they kind of ripped off that Deftones Band-Aid similarity. They are one of the bigger bands that are coming up in this alternative rock type of surge, and I would say they're a band definitely worth checking out, because that last album they had showed that they had quality in their writing, in their production, in their chemistry and everything. And now that I'm looking at my list, this is probably the only band that I actually listen to a lot. I've seen Narrowhead a bunch of times live, and they always tear the house down. So I don't think it's some sort of bias, because I never really liked the band when I first listened to their earlier stuff. No bias. And the last band that I'm going to be talking about that has some sort of Deftones influence is Loathe. Their 2020 album, I Let It In, and it took everything, had a bunch of Deftones-like vocals with the harmonies, and I won't even call them impressions because that's just kind of rude. I don't even think they do that on purpose. But the band has cited Deftones and Slipknot as an influence. And you can hear that a lot in songs like Is It Really You, Two-Way Mirror, and New Faces in the Dark. Mona, can you please leave? The instrumentals and chemistry with this band seem to be top notch. I have seen them live at Sick New World earlier this year, and I will say they had the crowd in the palm of their hands. I know that sounds cheesy, but that's kind of what it was. Everybody was so focused on the band and enthralled with what they were performing. So hats off to the band for having that ability. Serious props. The way they implement multiple singers is really nice, but in my opinion, they don't really have an album that really sticks out to me, and I feel like I have to show everybody and talk about online. Maybe down the line they'll have an album like that, and I'm sure they can pull it off. And some might say they do have an album, and it's the one I just mentioned, but in my opinion, it's not the craziest thing I've ever heard ever. And I'm not saying I need them to perform some lyrical masterpiece with such beautiful production and just the most amazing riffs of all time. I think just an album that can gravitate towards me, but who am I, man? But yeah, Deftones' influence is kind of astronomical if you think about it, and it took me aback because most bands that blow up online have some sort of inkling of influence from Deftones. Nonetheless, it's cool to see a bunch of bands celebrate Deftones that's been around for so many decades at this point. It makes it known that their music is very much alive, and I think will be alive for years and years and years and years. The bands I talked about are an obvious smaller sample, but in my opinion, some of the bigger names that have some type of influence from Deftones. I wonder how many times I said influence in this video. So yeah, thanks for watching. I know these bands are kind of big at the moment, but I'll leave their Spotify down below just in case you have no idea who they are. Deftones, forever.